What's going on, Notre Dame fans? Patrick Engel, joined by my colleague Tyler Horka of blueandgold.com, here at Notre Dame Stadium after Stanford came in here, beat Notre Dame 16-14 to drop the Irish to 500 on the season. And this was one that really nobody saw coming. Not us, not the folks in Las Vegas who set the betting lines, giving Notre Dame almost a 17-point favorite. Probably not any of the 77,000 plus people in attendance here tonight, or even however many watched on TV. But here we are, Notre Dame at 3-3, and just like it was when Marshall came in here a few weeks ago and beat them, a whole lot seemingly called into question of just where this thing goes from here, and really a lot of concern. So, your initial thoughts on a game that we didn't see coming, but Stanford still did enough and to deserve to win it.
Yeah, a couple things there. I'm going to blame Las Vegas for this because they duped us all. Here Notre Dame is basically playing a home game in Las Vegas, and now we can blame Las Vegas for this because what was Notre Dame, 16.5, 17-point favorite? They didn't play like one today, just like against Marshall, like you said. They didn't play like a 20-point favorite, whatever that was. So it's just perplexing, Notre Dame coming into this game on a 3-game winning streak, and there was a lot to like about what Notre Dame did in all 3 of those games, minus a quarter or 2 against California, but we're talking a month ago at that point. So the North Carolina win, they looked great offensively. Against BYU last week, pretty good offensively, could have been better in the red zone, but they did enough offensively to win, and they did enough defensively to win too. As has kind of been the theme, Stanford's not a very good football team, and Notre Dame's defense did enough defensively to win again today. There's some things you don't like. You need to turn them over a little bit, and you thought you got one if you're Notre Dame there. I think that was in the fourth quarter, but it comes back, and that was a tough break for Notre Dame because I think that you have to keep that with the call on the field. It was that close. So, but again, Marcus Freeman today said, we're not in the business of blaming anybody. We have to blame ourselves. This is a Notre Dame team that was shut out in the first half and looked a little better offensively in the second half, but if you barely gain 300 yards, you don't really expect to win any of the games that you play. They knew they were going up against a quarterback in Tanner McKee, who's pretty good, and Tanner McKee made enough plays. I thought there was a receiver for Stanford, Wilson, that made enough plays, and at the end of the day, that's really kind of what it came down to. If you're Notre Dame, what plays today outside of the 41-yard touchdown to Tobias Merriweather are you sitting there thinking, oh, that was a winning play? Notre Dame could win the game with a play like that. So it's just head-scratching because all of the things I said that they did well against Cal, against North Carolina, against BYU, from the start, they just didn't show up today. And I think that's what you can classify this as if you're Notre Dame and if you're Marcus Freeman. It was a no-show. They didn't show up.
And that first half is really a testament to that, where you come in after 2 pretty good games to really good games on offense, and one where you at least found a good half of one against Cal, and do almost nothing on first down, where the average yards per play gained was a little over 2 in the first half, plus a couple of penalties, a touchdown that wiped out. And even though you righted the ship enough to put together a couple of scoring drives, get a lead in the fourth quarter there, but I think the story of it's just as much as, like you said, Tanner McKee, Stanford offense, the run game there, found just enough, maybe more of those plays like you mentioned of, all right, keep a drive going, to get into the red zone or get into field goal range or push it across in the first half there. But it's really just like, I think after what Marshall told us, or some of the injuries that Notre Dame suffered early in the year with Tyler Buckner, or here in this game, you just didn't really have a lot of margin for error to make some of the mistakes they did, like an illegal motion penalty, getting the touchdown wiped off the board in the first half, just tackling problems that popped up again on a couple of those third and longs or third downs, or just anywhere that let Stanford rip off some big games, or big gains. Holding penalty, offsetting penalties that got rid of what would have been a stop on third down late in the game there to get your defense off the field. A 3rd and 7 there on Stanford's final drive before it took a knee. Just little mistakes like that added up that right now Notre Dame just can't overcome or isn't good enough to overcome. So when you make those, in addition to Stanford doing just enough to win there, you're going to get the result you get. And I think just kind of, insult to injury, a part of it here is the the fumble luck that we've seen them not really get a lot of forced fumbles. Here's a chance where you have a few of them and they just kind of, don't go your way. Sometimes that's just the game. You can't really blame it on anything other than, sometimes how the ball bounces and, certainly not why they lost the game here for a lot of other reasons.
Yeah, I think Notre Dame kind of told us what we were in for in terms of just watching this game from the very start, where Jarrett Patterson, your fifth-year starter at left guard, false start, puts you behind the chains. All of a sudden, Notre Dame goes 3 and out. Stanford gets the ball and makes it look really easy going down there, scores a touchdown. So there you are. Stanford defers to the second half, says, we'll put that Notre Dame offense on the field. And the Notre Dame offense got off the field in a hurry, and Stanford gets the ball and drives down. And then you're sitting there at 7-0 in a game. Like we said, you're favored by a touchdown or 2 touchdowns and a half and a field goal, essentially. So at home, you're playing a team that you should beat by that many points, and all of a sudden you're down 7-0. I think this Notre Dame team, with a first-year head coach, with a first-time starting quarterback, is at a point where it can't afford to put itself in those types of situations. It did a pretty good job against BYU when it fell behind early. Looked pretty good, looked pretty comfortable, but just from the start today, I think it felt like one of those games where you're like, oh no, Notre Dame's not going to have it in too many areas, and they might end up losing this ball game as a result of that. You mentioned the tackling. It was really poor. So for as well and as sound as this defense looks at times, there are just lapses and gaffes, and the tackling, I mean, you have to bring some of these guys down. There was a play where Stanford was facing 3rd and 12, deep in its own territory. All they did was swing a screen out to a wide receiver and said, if he doesn't get the first down here, we got more room to punt. If he gets it, then hey, we still have the football. And they converted on 3rd and 12 on a pass that was 2 yards behind the line of scrimmage immediately from the snap. So it's just things like that. J.D. Bertrand in his post-game press conference says it's all of these little things that are adding up, and it kind of is. When you lose 16-14 at home against a team that hasn't beaten an FBS foe in over a calendar year, it is those little things, because it's not the big things. A team like Stanford wasn't going to come in here and do big things and beat Notre Dame. They did a lot of little things. The field goals weren't little. They were pretty lengthy, but it was almost as if David Shaw said, hey, we got a kicker with a leg. We've got 4th and 2 from the 30 whatever. We'll send him out there, put points on the board. And that's kind of an insult to Notre Dame in the sense that he was like, hey, if we get 3 points here, 3 points there, we can beat this team. Guess what? That's what happened.
Yeah, not a game where you thought Stanford would be field goaling its way to a victory, just because nothing about their defense suggested they were going to stop Notre Dame. But here we are, and I think maybe the lesson here, the biggest surprise, is that Notre Dame came into this seemingly kind of figured out who it was and what it could do, and its formula for winning games being seemingly good enough to run the ball on defenses that are inferior to what it has on offense, and can at least be functional in the passing game. And that just didn't show up today, or at least not for 4 full quarters like we'd seen it for at least the last 2 games. And I think it's just kind of a lesson of, like, this is just going to be unpredictable. Just when you think you know what Notre Dame might be, or if it's found itself, or if it's found the right formula, it just didn't produce enough of it for 4 quarters, or even maybe a half. Like the second half, they woke up from a sense, because it was hard to be worse than the first half there, but still enough of those missteps, enough of those things that were just out of character compared to what you saw. And I think that's a lesson of, like, we halfway through the season, we still hear Marcus Freeman talking about and wondering about, have to figure out why. And halfway through, they haven't figured out why some of these execution errors that they're harping on keep popping up. And when that's the case and you're halfway through a season, like, I don't know that you can be confident of something like finding itself consistently for 6 games, where it might do that for 3 or even the next 2 or just next week. But I think maybe just in the sense of, like, thinking that there's an identity that it can create and replicate for 2 months or the second half of the year. Like, this was just a sign that, like, don't get ahead of your skis when it comes to that, because there's a lot of questions and a lot of things that they're still trying to put a finger on and can't, as far as why these things keep breaking down and why some of the execution mistakes we hear them talk about all the time keep happening, and yet they're still not totally erased here.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say on all of this is I'm a big believer that teams are at the end of the year still very much like they are at the beginning of the year. I know teams change, but in a sense, this Notre Dame team that lost to Marshall just over a month ago, it's still the same team. It's still the same guys, and I know the quarterback is different, but hey, by the way, that quarterback, I know I'm a big Drew Pine proponent, but that's a guy who lost an offseason quarterback competition, and that's a guy who started for the first time as a junior just a couple weeks ago. He was due for a clunker. This was that. Sub 50% passing. I think it was just over 100 yards or whatever it was, maybe 150 and a touchdown. He didn't throw any interceptions, but he didn't throw any balls outside of the one to Merriweather where we were like, yeah, this is going to be there all day and we're going to have that. And that's a first-time starting quarterback. And as it relates to the entire team, this is still led by a first-year head coach who we just talked to him in the post-game press conference. You kind of got that sense that you got after Marshall where you're like, man, I don't know. This guy's trying to figure it out, because there were a couple times there he was just like, this is frustrating, man. We're going to fix it. But I think now you start having to ask the question, how are you going to fix it? Or is this thing going to be fixed? Because from our perspective up here in the box, I'm not so sure.
No, and halfway through, the fact that they're still looking for answers like they were a month ago is enough reason for to figure out who knows exactly what the final 6 games will hold. But Notre Dame will try to snap out of it next week on what looked like the easiest game on paper on his schedule to begin the year. But assume nothing, as we've learned so far through 6 games here. But for Tyler Horka, I'm Patrick Engel of blueandgold.com, signing off after Stanford comes into Notre Dame Stadium and beats the Irish 16-14.